We are making our way through the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, which is one of 4 books in the opening of the New Testament that we call Gospels. These are 4 different accounts of the life of Jesus written by 4 different authors, with each having their own kind of unique perspective. And Matthew is one of Jesus' core followers. He's one of what we call the apostles. So Matthew's gospel specifically is he's writing what he saw and what he experienced. So Matthew's here for all this stuff, and he's saying, hey, when I was with Jesus, when I walked with Jesus, Jesus invited me personally. Here's what I saw. Here's what I experienced. Here's what I witnessed. So we've been making our way through Matthew's story about the life of Jesus. And for about 2.5 to 3 years, this period of time that is often referred to as the public ministry phase of Jesus' life, this is when he goes around teaching and performing miracles. It's from about the time he's 30 till, again, about the time he's 33. This is what Matthew spends most of his time talking about. What happens in this period of time? And throughout this 2.5 to 3 years, Jesus has been building this movement. The movement will eventually become known as the church, but during Jesus' lifetime, it's just kind of like, hey, it's Jesus and his movement. And his movement has this inner core of people. Probably the most inner core we talked about is the apostles, the 12, but there's also various other men and women who make up these people who are committed to him. They support him, they encourage him, they travel everywhere with him. But then outside of that core, there's always big crowds that follow Jesus. And these are people that like Jesus, they're interested in Jesus, they're not really committed though. They're still trying to see, we like where it goes, but just in case this goes south, we can still jump ship and it'll still be good. So you got the crowd, the committed core, you got the crowd, but Jesus also has managed to make quite a few enemies. People who do not like him, people who would rather him be out of the way. A lot of those enemies are people that have positions of power within first century Israel. Because, hey, Jesus is new, and anything that's new is a threat to my established power. So he's got a lot of resistance and a lot of opposition. As you start to get toward the end of Matthew's gospel, Jesus is leading his core followers to Jerusalem in order to celebrate the Passover. Passover is the holiday within the Jewish tradition. It's the big one. In some ways, it would be kind of like Christmas. It is the major holiday that everyone looks forward to. But as terms of its significance, it's actually their national holiday. So it would be almost more like the 4th of July would be here in the United States, because the national holiday is, hey, this is what celebrates us as a people. This is what celebrates the founding our nation and everything that we stand for. Passover was a celebration of how about 12 to 1400 years before Jesus shows up, the Israelite people were slaves in Egypt and God rescued them. God rescued them from their slavery, led them into the land of Canaan, and that's where they would settle down and become the nation of Israel. So Passover was this incredibly significant holiday. It was a major holiday. It was what was known as a pilgrimage festival. So most good Jewish people, if they were able to, wherever they lived, they would make the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. So this is what Jesus is doing. He's leading his followers into Jerusalem so that together they can celebrate the Passover. Now, when they get into Jerusalem, there's a huge scene. It's this incredibly chaotic scene. And Matthew describes it. Matthew says, here's how it went. Matthew 21, verse 7. They brought the donkey and the colt and placed their cloaks on them for Jesus to sit on. A very large crowd spread their cloaks on the road, while others cut branches from the trees and spread them along the road. The crowds went ahead of him, and those that followed shouted, "Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven." When Jesus entered Jerusalem, the whole city was stirred and asked, "Who is this?" So Matthew uses the word stirred to describe the reaction of all the people in Jerusalem when Jesus entered. That word stirred is usually used to describe earthquakes or apocalyptic events. So that's there's a natural disaster or something crazy. It's oh, we're all stirred. So there's excitement, there's fear, there's uneasiness, there's uncertainty. But when Jesus enters Jerusalem, for what will be the last time he's going to enter Jerusalem, there is this chaotic scene where the crowd, the core is with him, right? The core is pretty much always with him wherever he goes. But the crowd of people that are fascinated by him, that are interested by him, they literally line the street. And they are shouting for him. They're cheering for him. They're laying down cloaks and they're waving palm branches and they're cheering Hosanna, which means save us. In this case specifically, God save us. So they're shouting out for Jesus to save them. We want you to save us. They call him the Son of David, which Son of David is a way to refer to the Messiah. The Messiah is the one Jewish people believed that God would send to rescue them, to overcome the Romans, to reestablish Israel as its own independent kingdom. So it's this crazy, chaotic scene, and Jesus is riding on a donkey, which donkey may not seem real regal to you and I. Like if you saw someone riding down the street on a donkey, I don't know what you would think about that person, but in the history of Old Testament Israel, a donkey is a royal animal. King David in the Old Testament is often described as riding a donkey. So this picture of Jesus entering Jerusalem is filled with all of this language and imagery about the Messiah and about God rescuing his people, and this is who this is, and there's all of this incredible excitement. It is also very intentionally a recreation of a very similar parade that happened almost 200 years before Jesus shows up. If you go back into the 160 BCEs, so 160 years before Jesus is born, and then it takes 30 years for Jesus to kind of emerge and do his thing in public. But the people of Israel at that time were controlled by the Seleucid Empire, which was a Greek empire. And they outlawed traditional Jewish worship. They desecrated the Jewish temple by putting in, I believe it was a statue of Zeus, one of the Greek pagan gods. And so there was a revolt against the Seleucids led by the Maccabean family. And for a brief period of time, the Maccabees actually ended up securing the freedom of Jerusalem. They drove the Seleucids out, so Jerusalem itself was independent. Eventually they would kind of come back in, but for a period of time, they had some independence. And so when the Maccabean army, they were called the Hammer, when they rode into Jerusalem, like on their victory parade, they were greeted very much the same way that Jesus is greeted here. Palm branches are a symbol of victory, so they're waving, they're shouting. So what the crowd is doing here for Jesus is super intentional. They're using all of this language that ties it to the Old Testament, to the hope of the Messiah, that God is going to rescue his people. They're recreating this Maccabean victory parade because what they want is for Jesus to be their nationalistic hero. Rescue us, rescue our nation. Now, what's really fascinating is if you go back to the Maccabean victory parade, when that army rides into Jerusalem victoriously, the first thing they do is they go to the temple and they cleanse the temple. Because again, the Seleucid Empire had desecrated it with images of pagan gods. So they ride in, they cleanse the temple, and they restore it so that the temple becomes about just worshiping God, the one true God of Israel. Jesus, when he enters into Jerusalem and he's greeted with this recreation of the Maccabean victory parade, he also goes to the temple. So these people are shouting and cheering for him. Hey, we want you to be our national hero. We want you to embrace all these things from our past. We want you to do this. Jesus goes to the temple, but what Jesus does at the temple, he cleanses it, but very differently from the way that Maccabees does. Matthew says, here's how Jesus cleanses the temple. Matthew 21, verse 12. Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers. So Jesus is a little bit upset about what is happening at the temple. When he walks into the temple, he creates an epic scene, right? He overturns tables, he's yelling at people, he's shouting, he's saying, you, my people, have desecrated this temple. Not the Greeks and their pagan Zeus statues. You have desecrated this temple. And he overturns the tables and he causes all this scene and all this commotion. And it's fascinating because when Jesus rides into Jerusalem, the crowd is very clear of what they want Jesus to do and what they want him to be. We want you to be our nationalistic Messiah that is going to rescue us as a people. And Jesus, true to the Maccabean story, goes straight to the temple and says, no, I will not do what you want me to do. I'm going to do something completely different. Now, why is Jesus so mad about what's happening at the temple? What is it about the temple that makes Jesus so angry that he causes this scene? There's several possibilities that are specifically what tips him over. And different scholars debate over what it is that actually sets Jesus off. This is a picture of a model of the temple. If you ever go into Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Museum, they have this whole layout of what ancient Israel looked like. And so this is a model of what the temple looked like. In Jesus' day, this is what's known as Herod's temple. The original temple, the one that King Solomon built, is just the little building in the middle. But this is Herod's temple. Now, one of the things that Jesus could be mad about is they could be ripping people off for the charges of what they're charging people for animal sacrifices. Because remember, people are coming to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And when you came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover, you would go to the temple and make a sacrifice. So one of the things they could be doing is saying, hey, if you want to make a sacrifice, you have to buy your sacrificial animal in the temple. And look, I know that you can get a baby lamb outside in the city for $10, but in here it's $100. And it's, what are you going to do? I got to make the sacrifice. So that's one possibility. That may or may not have happened. That's one possibility, that he's actually mad because you're manipulating the system. The other thing he could be mad about is, you see that big outer court? That's what's known as the court of the Gentiles. The temple is filled with like curtains, essentially, that were access points. And the holier you were, the closer to God you were, the more curtains you could cross, right? The further into the temple you could go, the closer to God you could get. That outer court is the only place that Gentiles can go. When Jesus walks into the temple, the scene in the court of the Gentiles, which is what Matthew describes, is pretty chaotic. So the only place in the temple that non-Jews can go, they really can't worship, because it's this scene where everyone's just like making money. So it's also possible that Jesus is like, you're keeping people from actually connecting with God because you're trying to make money. So there could be some of these little things that these are like really what sets Jesus off. This is what makes him angry in the moment. But if you look at what Matthew says here and you compare it to what Matthew says throughout the rest of his gospel, it's not just one incident that sets Jesus off about the temple. Jesus is really kind of disgusted with what the temple has become, the totality of it. That for Jesus, the temple has become this corrupt symbol because it's filled with power and control. Because the temple, Jewish people believed, and not just Jewish people, ancient people believed, that gods lived in temples. And so if you wanted to meet with a god, if you wanted to make sacrifices to the god, you went to that temple. So if you control a temple, you control access to the god, and you can make people do whatever it is you want them to do. The Jewish temple is controlled by the Sadducees. If you're familiar with the life of Jesus at all, you know that there's these groups that don't like Jesus. One of the groups that doesn't like Jesus is the Pharisees. Pharisees are more like local pastors, though. Like, they're just kind of the teachers that are out in the communities. The Sadducees is another group that doesn't like Jesus. The Sadducees are the ones in first century Judaism that have all the power because they control the temple. And they're actually in league with Rome. So the Sadducees wield actual political authority. The Pharisees, people would like or not like Pharisees depending on their teachings and stuff like that, but the Sadducees have all of this power, and they use it to control people and to hold on to their own power. And so what Jesus does all throughout his life, all throughout the Gospel of Matthew, is like, hey, the temple is corrupt. It's become this system of control, because if I tell you the only way you get to God is through me, then you have to do whatever it is that I say. And I can control you, and I can build my own empire. And so one of the things Jesus does continually is he's like, yeah, the temple's obsolete. You don't need it anymore. Because the temple, remember, what is the temple? The temple is how you get access to God. Jesus comes along and says, yeah, no. Jesus said the way that you have access to God is, surprise, surprise, you're looking at him. That I'm God in the flesh. If you've seen me, Jesus says, you've seen the Father. Jesus says the way you live in connection and relationship with God is not by going to this building and doing what these people tell you to do. The way you live in connection with God is you live in connection with me. And so Jesus is introducing a whole new way of living, a whole new way of being in connection to God. And it's through him, first through his physical person, but then later on, he will send his spirit, his presence to live among his people. And so what Jesus is doing by saying, hey, you don't have to go through these people. You don't have to go through this place. You have direct access to God through me. You live in connection and relationship with God through me. This is irrelevant. This is obsolete. Jesus will even say, yeah, this whole thing is going to get torn down. And it does get torn down in the year 70. It's about 40 years after Jesus, the Romans will come in and destroy this temple. So it's not just one thing that sets Jesus off about the temple, it is what the temple has become. And Jesus now has shown up to institute this whole new way of being and living that isn't controlled by anyone else. It's as people, how do we live in this dynamic connection and relationship with our Creator, God? And just to be clear, this is what gets Jesus killed. The reason he gets killed is because of what he does at the temple. Because again, remember, who has all the power? Sadducees have the power. Pharisees don't like Jesus from the very beginning. For like 2.5, 3 years, Jesus has been walking around and the Pharisees are like, we got to kill this guy, we got to kill this guy, we got to kill this guy. But Pharisees don't have any power. Jesus crosses the Sadducees and he's dead a week later. So this is actually what gets Jesus killed, is the action that he takes specifically against the temple. Now, all of this happens on what we call Palm Sunday, which is what we celebrate today. The last week of Jesus' life, a lot of times we call it the Passion Week or whatever. It starts on Sunday where Jesus enters into Jerusalem on the whole Palm Sunday scene. They greet him. He goes to the temple and he cleanses the temple. The next few days, remember, Jesus has come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover with his apostles, and he's going to. But the next few days, Jesus kind of meanders in and out and all through Jerusalem, and he's teaching some pretty controversial stuff. He keeps talking about the destruction of the temple and how the temple is going to be destroyed. He talks about paying taxes to Caesar, which taxes it's always a thing people like to discuss, especially this time of year. Hopefully you've done your taxes, by the way. You still have a couple more days. Talks about taxes. He goes on to this kind of tirade a little bit about religious leaders, the first century religious leaders, and how they've got it all wrong. And then he keeps telling all of these stories about how all the people who think they're in when it comes to God, like all the people who think, oh, we're righteous, we're holy, we're in. Jesus is like, now actually you're out. And all the people who you keep saying are out, they're actually in. So after Jesus has already ticked off the Sadducees and they're looking for a reason, he just builds on that. He's like, well, the end is here. We might as well get into all the stuff that nobody wants to hear anyway. So he's just hammering all this kind of controversial stuff. And the Sadducees are like, okay, we got to get rid of him, we got to get rid of him, we got to get rid of him. But we don't want to start a riot. Because if we start a riot, we get in trouble with Rome. And we don't want to get in trouble with Rome because, again, we don't want to lose our power. Finally, one of Jesus' core followers, one of the apostles, a guy by the name of Judas, agrees to betray Jesus. And what's really interesting, you can go back and read it if you want to. The reason he agrees to betray Jesus is because they get into a fight over money. There's this little situation and the apostles are talking about money and how you use money, and Judas doesn't like what Jesus says, so he's like, fine, I'm going to sell you out to your enemies. So Judas agrees to sell Jesus out. They're going to kind of do it private on the DL so that they can get away with it and they won't cause a riot. So then you get to Thursday. And Thursday is now the day that Jesus is going to celebrate the Passover with his followers. So he gets together with the 12 to celebrate this Passover. And the fact that he gets together with the 12 to celebrate Passover is a pretty big deal. Because Passover traditionally is a family celebration. You get together with your family and you celebrate it. And so the fact that Jesus celebrates it with these 12 people, like he's basically saying, like, this is a new family that we're creating. That's why the New Testament will use the language family to talk about the church. That this is what it comes from, that Jesus is saying, hey, this is a new family that we're creating. So they get together and they celebrate Passover, but what Jesus does about Passover is like, it's disrespectful and it's crazy. Because again, remember, we said Passover is the national holiday. This is what celebrates Israel's founding as a nation. God rescued us from slavery in Egypt, took us to the land of Canaan. And Passover is a very structured celebration. If you've ever celebrated a Passover or read anything about it, Passover has a very specific order. This is the food you eat, and you eat it in this order, and you do this, and you do this, because each thing reminded us of a different aspect of the Exodus story. This is about this is about that, this is about this. What Jesus does is like takes the whole thing and says, yeah, forget all that. This is all about me now. Again, just imagine, okay? We live in a very patriotic city. We have, to my knowledge, what is still the largest 4th of July parade west of the Mississippi that comes right down Main Street every 4th of July. Imagine somebody in the 4th of July parade stands up and says, hey, I know typically on the 4th of July we remember the Revolutionary War and all these people that gave their lives so that we could have freedom. But you know what? From now on, I don't want you to do that. I want you to celebrate me and my awesomeness. You can log on to my Instagram. Here it is. Click on my YouTube channel, like and subscribe. From now on, the 4th of July is about me. Imagine the reaction from the people that have lined the street. There would be anger. There would be, like, you can't do that. You can't take our thing and make it about you, but that is exactly what Jesus does. It's exactly what he does. Matthew, who's there, he says, here's what happened. Matthew 26, verse 26. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he'd given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and when he'd given thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. This is when Jesus begins what we call like communion. And this event is known as the Last Supper because it's the last meal he eats with his followers before his arrest and his crucifixion. And what Jesus does in that is he says, hey, I know as a people, we have celebrated this forever. I want you to go on celebrating it, but I want you to celebrate something completely different. The old thing was about the Exodus. The new thing isn't about the Exodus. The new thing, Jesus says, is about what I'm about to do for you. It's about my body. It's about my blood. It's about my sacrifice. It is about my death. Jesus says, from now on, this is what I want you to remember. And this is what I want you to celebrate. And the reason why that's so important is because Jesus understands that our primary identities are based around the stories that we tell. Every group of people has stories. And those stories define our identity. They define who we are. Being a part of a family is about understanding the family's stories. Like my family, I've said this before, my dad's side of the family, when I was growing up, the stories were all about cars. What car you owned, and I sold this car to get that car, and this car to get that car. The reason is because my great-grandfather up in San Francisco was a mechanic. And he worked on cars, and that's what he did. And when he came down, and my grandfather married into that family, there was a gas station in the family at one point, and then they owned a manufacturing plant that made all kinds of tools that you'd use to work on cars, things like car jacks and industrial tools. And so cars was the family business. So you had to learn that. That's why I'm a bad member of my dad's family, because I just drive a truck that I don't even really wash more than once or twice a year. But anyway, those were the stories, right? Those were the stories. And you had to know those stories and know those people, because those stories, they weren't just telling us about events, they were telling us what's important to us, what matters to us. When I married into Linda's family, I had to learn Linda's stories. Right? One of the coolest things we did is we were in New York a few years ago, and Linda's grandma, who she was really close to, came over from Italy after the Spanish flu in 1917, and she came through Ellis Island, literally on a boat. So we went to Ellis Island, and you can go and you can look up the database, and we found the ship manifest that had Linda's grandma on it that came over, I think when she was 10 years old. And we're able to look at it, and it's a neat thing. And it's like, hey, if I'm gonna be a part of this family, this is the story that I have to understand, because this is a part of our identity. I've been a part of this church for 22 years. This church has stories. We were founded by 13 people in 1895 who first met on a Sunday night in the old Ocean View Schoolhouse. And if you're wondering where the Ocean View Schoolhouse used to be, it's the BJ's that's up by the 405 freeway. That corner of the street was the Ocean View Schoolhouse. That's where this church first began in 1895. Apparently it was a cold night, is what I'm told. But there was these people that came together because they felt like in this area that was largely still farming land at the time, there needed to be a church. And out of a sense of adventure and commitment to Jesus, they came together. And that helps define a part of our DNA. That's where our identity comes from. Even when you look at when you look at, we would call them political things, but I would call them ideologies. When you look at the ideologies that dominate our day, like the political divides that dominate our day, we tend to talk about those as, they're competing agendas. Not really. You know what they actually are? They're competing stories. They have different stories. All right, so if you look like at political divides in our country, right? You got the right and the left. It's not just like, oh, we think this is different. It's, no, we have a fundamentally different story on where did our country come from and where's our country going. And so what you see competing is those different stories. You know, where did we come from? What did we value? What is going to lead to success? And you get tension because those stories compete with one another. You see the same thing, honestly, when it comes to issues of race in this country. Because you'll have one group of people that like, we have a story about this country, but then you'll have another group of people who have a different ethnic background. It's like, their story about this country is very different. And so you have these competing stories. And what happens most of the time, almost on a subconscious level, is when we encounter a story that is different from ours, we resist it. We resist, we condemn, and we attack. Because it's like, I have my story. I have my story on what makes me good, on what, like, I have my story on what leads to success, what leads to, and when somebody comes along with a different story, it is a threat. And so we will resist it, we will deny it, and a lot of times we will attack that person or attack those people because their story, it's not just that it disagrees with my story, but because our stories are where we find our identity, you are attacking my very identity. And so what Jesus is doing here is incredibly profound because the story that has defined the people of God for 1,200 to 1,400 years, he's changing it. Now, don't hear him wrong. Jesus isn't saying the Exodus doesn't matter. He's not saying forget about the Exodus, it's not important. There's still a lot to learn from the Exodus. You still learn about God, you learn about people, you learn about oppression, you learn about sin. There's a lot to learn from the Exodus. But what Jesus is saying, because Jesus shows up at a time when Israel's controlled by Rome, and what Jesus is doing is out of the ashes, he's reconstituting the people of God. He's recreating the people of God. But he's doing it with a different foundational story. I know this has been your story for so long, but this is going to be our story now. As we regather the people of God, we are going to give it a fundamentally different story, which will then in turn lead to a different identity. And see, the hard part about it is the Exodus story is a great foundational story because it's a story about victory. We conquered the most powerful empire on the planet, the Egyptians. The cross is not so much a great foundational story because it's about suffering and it's about sacrifice and it's about pain. And Jesus knows that. After the Last Supper, Jesus takes his followers just outside of the city to a place called the Garden of Gethsemane. And he prays there. And here's what he prays. Matthew 26, verse 38. Then he said to them, my soul, this is Jesus talking to his followers. He says, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and he prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. The heart of prayer, as modeled by Jesus, is surrender. Yeah, you ask Jesus for things. You take concerns and stresses or whatever. You lay them before Jesus. But the heart of it is that last phrase, not what I will, but what you will. Not what I want, but what you want. God, I want what you want more than I do what I want. And so Jesus knows how rough this is going to be. It's why he's begging to get out. He tells his followers, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. He prays all night to surrender that. And then here comes Judas. Here's his opportunity. Jesus is alone. I mean, he's got his followers there, but the crowd is not there. Judas leads in an armed, basically, gang that's probably made up of like temple guards, but also probably just some thug people that they found. Hey, come help us. They come to arrest Jesus. Jesus' followers want to fight. Peter pulls out a sword. He had a sword on him. At the Last Supper, he had a sword. That never makes any pictures. Why do you carry a sword? You carry a sword because you want to fight. or because you think you're going to fight. Peter pulls out a sword and cuts a dude's ear off. Jesus is like, no. Put that away. Heals the guy's ear. Sorry. Forgive him. Does not let his apostles fight and gives himself up. Matthew tells us that Jesus' followers scatter and flee. They're gone. Jesus is put on trial before first the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish ruling council, and then they send him to the Roman governor, who is Pilate. And as a part of Jesus' trials, if you read them, everything he said about the temple comes up. Like, why did you say this about the temple? That's, you're threatening revolution here at this point. The Sanhedrin doesn't want to hear that. Rome doesn't want to hear that. Everything Jesus said about himself being God, that's more of an issue with the Sanhedrin because this is about our faith. But all the stuff Jesus said about himself being a king, that becomes an issue with Rome because, hey, we have a king. His name is Caesar. You can't be the king. That's treason. Now, ultimately, Jesus' fate is really up to the Roman governor Pilate. He's the one with the power to be able to execute someone. Pilate doesn't want anything to do with it. Pilate's like, I think you all are mad at one another. I don't even understand what your fight is about. I don't think this guy's done anything wrong. Pilate he feels kind of trapped. He tries to get out of it using this custom. There was a custom that he would release a prisoner to the Jewish people at Passover time as like hey, this is how we keep good relations here. I'll do something nice for you. And so he presents two options. One is Jesus, who really hasn't done anything. One is like a notorious criminal. And he's like, which one do you want? And the whole point is, it's an easy decision. And the crowd shouts for the other guy. And Pilate, stunned, is like, well, what do you want me to do with Jesus? And here's their response. Matthew 27:22. What shall we do then with Jesus, who is called the Messiah? Pilate asked. They answered, crucify him. Why? What crime has he committed? Asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, crucify him. This is on Friday. This is the same crowd, keep in mind, that the Sunday before, Hosanna, Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Rescue us, save us. 5 days later, that same crowd, crucify him, kill him. That's all it took for them to turn. 5 days. So Pilate stuck. He has nothing else he can do because if Pilate allows an uprising to happen, then he's going to get in trouble with Rome. So Pilate orders Jesus beaten and crucified. Crucifixion was not a quick way to kill someone. If you wanted to kill someone quickly, then cut their head off or something like that. Crucifixion was designed as a form of torture and as a symbol to other people that, hey, don't do what they did. Because if you do what they did, you're going to share in their fate. So ultimately, the way you would die in crucifixion was you would actually suffocate. That you would get to the point that you couldn't lift yourself up to breathe and you would suffocate. That's why sometimes if they got tired of waiting for you to die, they would break your legs. Because then you can't lift yourself up to breathe. So they hang Jesus up there. He's up there for 6 hours. Matthew 27, verse 45, from noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness came over the land. About 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And if you skip to verse 50, and when Jesus had cried out again in a loud voice, he gave up his spirit. There is a group of women there at the foot of the cross, including his mom, that watch him die. Matthew says there was darkness, and he means that literally and figuratively. That this is the hour when darkness reigns over creation, that we have killed our Creator. But also, physically, it was dark, which it usually is not between 12 and 3. And then what Matthew says is really interesting. He says, Jesus gave up his spirit. All the way until the very end, it was Jesus' choice. He had the power. He could have gotten out of it at any moment. But he didn't. He gave up his life. A follower of his, a wealthy guy by the name of Joseph of Arimathea, takes his body and buries him in a tomb. We're told that it's a brand new tomb, which means there's no other bodies in it. And he seals that tomb, and Jesus is buried in there. Now, It's not the end of the story. But that is the part of the story that Jesus told his followers, this is what I want you to remember and celebrate. When you take communion, when you take that little piece of bread and that little cup of juice, this is what I want you to remember. My death and my sacrifice. What I gave for you. What Jesus tries to do throughout his whole life, but a lot here in the last week of his life, what he's trying to do is one of the most difficult things that you can do. He's trying to help people change their imagination. And when I say imagination, I'm not just saying about fictitious things, but I'm talking about the way that we think, the way that we view, the way that we view other people. See, all of us as people, we are born into families, we're born into communities, we're born into groups, we're born into cultures, we're born into nations that have a very specific imagination, a way that we think about things. And again, it's founded on our story. We tell this story about who we are as a people. That story shapes our identity, which in turn shapes our imagination. This is how we think about things. This is how we think about the world. This is how we think about other people. This frames the way that we think about all of this stuff. And Jesus is born into a first century world that has, at its foundational, this specific story and this understanding that shapes the way that everyone thinks. And what Jesus is trying to do, and he does it most clearly at the Last Supper, is he's trying to form a completely different imagination in this group of people. An imagination that's not centered around what it used to be centered around, but is centered around something. But that's a really difficult thing to do because, again, when you are born into a culture, when you are born into a people, when you are born with a certain foundational story, that is just ingrained into you almost on a subconscious level. And as you grow up within that culture, within that system, you are actually rewarded or punished based on how well you do in that system. And I don't mean necessarily physically punished, but if you do it well, you get good grades, you get good jobs, you become successful, you make money, you do it. So you're rewarded or you're penalized based on how well you fit into this very specific imagination in the place, in the group, in the culture in which you live. And so what Jesus does is he's trying to reform the people of God with a completely different imagination, beginning with a totally different foundational story. And this is a foundational story that's rooted in the cross. It's rooted in sacrifice. It's rooted in what we give up and how we give of ourselves to the benefit of other people. And again, the problem is when someone comes along with a different story, when someone comes along with a different narrative, when someone comes along with a different imagination, it is a threat to the status quo. It is a threat. And so again, our natural reaction is to resist that. To resist, and not only to resist, but to attack it. In order to maintain my identity and my imagination, I will deny yours and I will attack yours and I will attack you so that I can hold on to mine. Which is exactly what happens with Jesus. See, we tend to focus on the fact that Jesus is ultimately executed by those who are in power. The Sadducees and Rome, the governor, Pilate, right? They're the ones that have authority. But again, if you go back and read the story, why does Pilate ultimately order the execution of Jesus? Because the crowd cheers for it. Crucify him. And Pilate knows if I don't make these people happy, they're going to revolt. If they revolt, I'm going to get in trouble. So I need to hold on to my own power. Yes, the powerful people didn't like Jesus because he was a threat to them. Their rejection of Jesus was for obvious reasons. You are a threat to my power. You are a threat to my status, to my control. I want to get rid of you. But we sometimes forget that what leads to Jesus' death is the crowd. And the crowd's rejection of Jesus is not them trying to hold on to their own power. The crowd's rejection of Jesus is because they cannot in themselves think in a different way. They have a very specific story that's rooted in their nationalistic identity as the people of God. And they make abundantly clear to Jesus, this is what we want from you. And Jesus says, no, I'm not doing that. I'm doing something completely different. I'm doing something that is for anyone, for everyone, and it's not rooted in this victorious exodus. It's rooted in the cross. He even told his followers, if you want to be my disciple, what do you have to do? Deny yourself, take up your cross, and follow me. And the crowd said, no, we will not do that. Your story, your imagination is a threat to ours, and we will not go with you. Therefore, our only choice is to crucify you. You might disagree with me on this, and let me just say what I'm about to say is my opinion. So you can disagree if you want, but I really believe, 100% honestly believe, that if Jesus was to show up today in our cultural context, a large number, if not most, American evangelical Christians would respond to Jesus the same way most first century Jewish people did. For the exact same reason. Because Jesus is not an American evangelical. He doesn't think like you and I do. Like, he has a totally different foundational story. The reality is, this is not a judgment of you. Don't hear me wrong. I'm talking about the whole thing of which I am a part of. So I'm not criticizing someone else. I'm talking about us. Like, the American evangelical world is shaped far more by the American part than it is by the evangelical part. And we have this foundational story and understanding that really is not rooted in the cross. It's far more of an individualistic, consumer, capitalistic, democratic mindset. This is what we value. This is what's important. This is our story. And when anyone threatens that, we resist and we attack. Jesus was ultimately crucified because he was trying to form a new imagination among a people who had a pre-existing imagination, and they were like, nope, not going to happen. And they killed him for it. If we really want to be a part of what it is that Jesus is doing, it's going to take from us the same thing that it would have taken from people in the first century. Paul says it the best in Romans 12:2. He says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. That what needs to be changed in us isn't just a behavior here or there, it's literally our entire imagination. It's the way that we think. It's our foundational story. It's what we believe about ourselves and about others and about the world. Arguably, one of the most influential Christians of last century was a guy by the name of C.S. Lewis. Most people, whether or not you're a Christian, are probably familiar with Lewis. He's most famous. I brought a picture of him that you can put up here. He's most famous for writing the Chronicles of Narnia. Lewis would describe his life. He would say he was born a Christian, but then he left in his teens for various reasons. And he pursued academic pursuits. He became like a literary scholar. But Lewis would come back to faith in his early 30s, largely under the influence of J.R.R. Tolkien, who was the guy who wrote Lord of the Rings. And what's interesting is when you read Lewis, or hear Lewis, he's long since passed away, but when he talks about his conversion, his adult conversion back, what he'll say was that a big part of his conversion was his imagination. That as a trained, literary scholar, right? And early on, he would describe himself as an atheist literary scholar. What he saw in through his intellect was a world, and these are his words, that was grim and meaningless. This was the world that he himself said he saw through literary study and analysis. But what drew him to imagination and fiction, ultimately stuff like the Chronicles of Narnia and things like that, was what he found in fantasy was a search for meaning, dignity, and immortality. And so he saw these two contrasting realities and that there was different ways of thinking and being. And so ultimately when Lewis would convert back to Christianity, here's what he would say was a part of his conversion. That he talked about, and again, this is his words, the baptism of his imagination. That it wasn't just, I have to change a couple things I do. I can't, what's the old phrase? I can't smoke, cuss, chew, or go with people who do. It's I can't just do those. It literally has to be in the very essence of my mind. The way I think, the way I view, the way I operate. And that begins, to Jesus' point, with what is your foundational story? Because that's what determines your identity. Now I know some of us are going well, what about resurrection? What about resurrection? Resurrection's cool. Resurrection's neat. It is. We're going to talk all about that next week. All about that next week. But I want to remind us, this is the part of the story that Jesus told his followers. Remember this. Celebrate this, because resurrection's the fun part. Resurrection's the exciting part. The cross is the difficult part. But that's the part of the story that Jesus told us to embody. That's the part of the story Jesus told us to live. That's the part of the story that Jesus gave to the church, and he says, this is your foundational story. This is what defines your identity. This is the lens through which you view everything. And so I think here's the question you and I have to wrestle with as a church, as a community, but also as individuals. What story or image shapes your imagination? And I would encourage you to really have honest conversations. When you get down to it, what is the foundational story from which you drive most of your identity? That shapes your values, that shapes how you view people, that shapes how you live, that shapes how you posture yourself toward everything. See, what Jesus used to form the imagination of his people, what we would call a Christian imagination, was the cross. Jesus said, this is our story. This is our identity. This is who we are. And I think it's time we have to be really honest and ask ourselves, is that our story? Or are we shaped more by something else? And if we're shaped more by something else, then like Lewis, what we need is a baptism of our imagination. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for your love for us. I thank you that you came down to this earth in the person of Jesus, that you died, that you rose again, and that you are making all things new. And Father, you have invited us into a way of life that is completely different. There has never been a culture, a civilization on earth that has embodied the cross. You can't do it. It's from a nationalistic perspective, it's not sustainable. But God, the church is this worldwide movement of people submitted to you and to your lordship and to your kingship. And Father, what makes us the church is that we are yours, that your story is our story, that it shapes how we view ourselves, how we live, and who we are. Father, help us to be a people, help us to be a church that is built upon the story of the cross. And yes, there's difficulty in that story, but there's also beauty, because the cross is the means by which all things are being made new, the means by which death is being overcome. So it's not easy, but it's powerful, and it's life-giving, and it's filled with hope and joy. Father, we thank you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.